With Total War Warhammer 2's lifecycle coming to a close and Total War Warhammer 3 launching sometime in the future, there's one thing I want to discuss, and it is our stunty folk of the mountains, the Dwarfs. Now, the Dwarfs were one of the very first races to get what was called, or is now termed, an Old World update. And this is essentially a chance to bring any of the Old World races, or races from Total War Warhammer 1, up to snuff, up to that same level of quality or expertise, whatever you want to look at, that you get in Total War Warhammer 2. This often includes a new mechanic, a new unique resource, and then maybe some fine-tuning to starting locations, legendary lores that are maybe included as part of a free LC, or free downloadable content, or any number of other tweaks that really kind of help bring a faction up. We most recently saw this with the Greenskins Old World update, which was fantastic. Now, one big problem here is that the Dwarfs have kind of an interesting road ahead of them. And this is the kind of focus for this video today is, let's talk about the big problem with the Dwarfs as it is in their campaign, in multiplayer, just their battles as a whole. So when we look at the Dwarf campaign, we see a campaign that has become very watered down, especially in light of what the Greenskin update has done. The Dwarfs is just a slog for them to work through all of the Confederation, the Wa armies, all of the really strong stuff that the Greenskins can now bring to the table. Now, in addition to this, if we just look at the armies themselves, the Dwarfs have no real big centerpiece model. Now, when I say centerpiece model, I'm talking about a really larger-than-life, big, huge monster. The rogue idol of Gork or Mork, the Stegodons, the dragons, the Dreadsaurian, any of these large, huge beasts that have been added with almost every single DLC. And these beasts really act as a way to just push through lines very effectively. They get in these big, huge, awesome beast-on-beast battles. There's a lot of really cool things. And if the Beastman update or DLC goes through in the next DLC, and that adds stuff like the Gorgons or the Jabberslythe or any of the other big, huge creatures to the Beastmen, the Dwarfs will continue to have a pretty interesting problem. So as it stands right now, the Dwarfs don't have a lot of what is called mass, the ability to really stop large targets from moving through their lines. Really, the ultimate crux to the Dwarf military are chariots. You could just ride dirty through all of the Dwarf lines really without being deterred. And the interesting thing here is that this is only going to get worse for the Dwarfs. And the Dwarfs do have a lot of really great answers to things, right? They've got the Trollhammer torpedoes, they've got cannons, they've got volley guns, they've got catapults, they've got flame cannons, they've got all these this amazing array of artillery and engineers that buff that artillery, something that the Empire doesn't even get. So there are still answers to these large creatures in the Dwarf arsenal. So let's not kind of discredit them. And they do also get the Giant Slayers, something that came with the Dwarf Old World update. This is a version of the Slayer unit that has anti-large and AP because it has a great axe, a two-handed axe. So the big issue here, though, is that even though they have all of these tricks of the trade, even Rangers with Regiments of Renown, or a Regiment Renown Ranger that can greatly reduce the missile parry and missile defensive units to really kind of cut them down with range fire and AP range fire because they use great axes, there are still just there's a huge issue with the Dwarfs. And when we take a look at Tabletop, the Tabletop in the 8th edition for the Dwarfs was quite strong. They weren't, top tier like the Chaos Daemons were of old, but they had a lot of tools that they could use to destroy dragons, to destroy monstrous infantry, to do a lot of damage to things. And the way that the damage worked for cannons against, say, dragons and the such is just much different than it is now. You can get really lucky and outright kill a dragon if you maxed all of your rolls properly in 8th edition, and that was a huge strength, but it was easy for the Dwarfs to field multiple cannons in their armies to kind of maximize that amount of damage to dragons. In fact, large beasts like dragons in 8th edition fantasy, from a competitive standpoint, were typically not taken because it was such a huge point sink that could be destroyed so quickly in turn 1, if not turn 2. And in Total War Warhammer, we don't really get that, and we shouldn't, right? I don't want to see dragons get deleted by cannons so quickly. That would just not make the game very fun. In fact, it didn't make 8th edition very fun when it came to using dragons. You wanted to, but you knew that, okay, there's 500-600 points that would just get swiped off the table quickly. And 500 or 600 points, not just 5 or 6, that'd be weird. But when we take a look at Warhammer 3, the problem with the Dwarfs is only going to get worse. We look at the Ogre Kingdoms, which is an army entirely comprised of monstrous infantry, huge beasts, and more monstrous infantry. We take a look at stuff like the Chaos Daemons, which every single flavor of ruinous power has its own style of chariot, its own style of artillery, its own greater demon, its own monstrous infantry. Just a massive amount of large creatures coming to the table that are going to just throw the dwarf army into disarray. And then we look at Chaos Dwarfs. Now, of course, we don't know any of these races to be confirmed. This is mainly conjecture, but they did say that every single race that had an army book will get representation in Total War Warhammer, but that was way back in Total War Warhammer 1. So Chaos Dwarfs, though, are all of the benefits of being dwarfs with also monstrous objects. They get monstrous infantry. They get bull centaur or bulgors or whatever the hell their names are, but half centaur, half dwarf, basically. The Kadai, all these huge monsters inhabit the Chaos Dwarf roster. So ways to really kind of pin things down. And Kislev too. Kislev could have bear cavalry. They'll have all the benefits of being the Empire with a couple more monstrous cavalry probably sprinkled in there. So when we look at the dwarf line, we see a dwarf line that can be easily penetrated by chariots, by big huge monsters that can just slap right through things. And sure, you do have slayers, which can threaten into things very easily with anti-large capabilities. Got the giant slayers, which again, anti-large and AP damage. You've got thunderers, which bring a lot of AP to the table. You've got rangers, you've got the crossbowmen. So you do have a lot of tricks that you can use. But what I find frustrating about the dwarfs is, especially if you're a new player, it's going to be harder for you to realize that, okay, I have to build my army into these multiple layers with infantry and then ranged, and then more infantry, and then more range to kind of have cross lines of fire and enfilade, as it were. And if you don't really know that, you're going to be very frustrated playing an army which is supposed to be, you know, this rock against the crashing waves of the enemy forces. And right now, I think that there are too many ways to just kind of bully around dwarfs as far as their mass goes. And that's not a height joke this time around. And when I say mass, I'm talking about the ability for a unit to field a charge without getting completely pushed over, or just have the thing path through it and move through it. And there's only so much mass you can increase on the dwarfs before they just become kind of uncharacteristic, unrealistic, right? Like if a dwarf is taking a charge in from a dragon ogre Shaggoth and just kind of moves a little bit, that's kind of ridiculous, right? A little unrealistic. So I think that the dwarfs need that big centerpiece model. And this is something that I've talked about in my Master and Molder DLC speculation, where I was talking about Thoric Ironbrow versus Throth the Unclean, a dwarf and Skaven DLC theme. And I'm going to link that in the upper right. You can go ahead and check that out. But I go into a little bit better detail about this and bring up a lot of these same issues. But if we don't get these large creatures into some sort of monstrous infantry, or some sort of, monstrous is kind of a weird word to use when it comes to dwarfs, or some sort of large monstrous creature, then I think the dwarfs are going to continue to struggle, especially as the game progresses through the end of Game 2 into the beginning and end of Game 3. And my answer for that is one, if not all, of three things. Runic Guardians, which are essentially these, they were in the Warhammer RPG, and I don't really have a great way to describe them, but essentially it's like they're a little bit larger than normal dwarf, imbued suits that kind of guard, I think it was just normal holds or something of the sort, but they're these guardians that are more like automatons than actual dwarfs. And these things would be, I would say, you know, larger than normal dwarfs, so like monstrous infantry, quote unquote. And they kind of look a little bit more like the sock and bopper portion of the lizardmen that I can't think of, the Croxagores with sock and boppers on, or runic golems, which are these large, huge golems that would be smashed around. Think World of Warcraft and all those little golems in Ulduar, I think it is. Something like that. These big, huge monstrous rock beasts that are, you know, carved in a way that is very dwarfy. And I think that just one, if not two of those, would be amazing to just kind of add something in the dwarf line that can meet the charge of a Dread Saurian, that can meet the charge of a Rotting Leviathan. And instead of having this thing just rampage through your lines very easily, like, don't even get me started on the Tomb Scorpion. That thing's just going to go all willy-nilly. Good luck trying to catch it with Slayers, even if they do, quote-unquote, move fast. But the last thing I think would really be awesome for the dwarfs, and if it played into like a Thoric Ironbrow DLC, would be the Shard Dragon. Now the Shard Dragon is really cool, right? It's this dragon that's deep down under the earth, and it's bound by these runic collars created by the runesmiths to essentially control them. That's very dwarfy. It's in the Monstrous Arcanum. I think it makes for a really cool, awesome, big, large centerpiece model. I'm sure there's a mod out there that can add these guys. There's one for the Merworm, so I could see them doing one for the Shard Dragon. But it could use essentially the exact same framework as the Dread Saurian, reskin that bad boy, make it a Shard Dragon, because that's the biggest thing when it comes to all these development changes or things that we would like to see added to the game. Creative Assembly has to look at the cost of creating the framework or the 3D framework for any of these models, and that is the most expensive development cost of adding any new unit to the game. That's straight from the words of Rich himself. He said, sure, we'd like to add all these things, but we have to weigh in what the development budget is. Can we even afford that? How do we already have the asset created that we can repurpose for it? Like a good example would be the Arachnarok Spider and the Rotting Leviathan. Both have the same base framework, but they're entirely different as far as everything else after that. And it allows them to save a ton of development budget to create these things in the game that I think add so much spice and so much flavor. Like the Dwarfs right now, I know they got their old world update, but they need like more of an old world update. And they need something that has a heavier lean on rune crafting and smithing. That was such a huge portion of the army books for the Dwarfs since the dawn of time. And it's a huge portion of Dwarf lore across almost any continuum. So I think that there's a huge problem with the Dwarfs. And I think it extends to their roster, their campaign, and their individual mechanics that have been added and revised, but still are just starting to fall beside all of the even better mechanics that have been improved upon with each new DLC for Total War Warhammer 2. And this was a little quick video I wanted to do to discuss this issue, because I've seen a lot of people say, you know, Dwarfs used to be my favorite faction, and now I just don't like playing them anymore. Their campaign is so miserable, it's such a slog, and we're getting the same thing when we talk about the Beastmen or the old Greenskins. Now the Greenskins have this really cool, fun, awesome campaign that the Beastmen don't have, and the Dwarfs now don't have, because the Greenskins are just that much cooler. So I think that there's a definite problem with the Dwarfs, and I think that if it's not faced now, before we get to Game 3, the disparity, that power disparity is only going to get worse as we get more monstrous units added to the game. With the increased success of Total War Warhammer 2 and 3, well, that's going to make for more budget, and that's going to allow for increased, cooler, bigger, awesome creatures coming to the table. And we've seen how Creative Assembly is already dipping pretty heavily into the Monstrous Arcanum for almost every single DLC, and this brings larger-than-life creatures to the table. So if we don't see some sort of revamp for the Dwarfs moving into Game 3, they'll just kind of be left to the wayside. And I think that's a huge tragedy, because there are so many awesome ways that you can improve upon the Dwarfs without really having to do a whole ton. I would be totally fine if they did some sort of, like not Skull for Skull Thrones is specific, but to use that as an example, some sort of event that would grant us an FLC that just gives us runic golems or shard dragons or runic guardians, something to add anchoring, something to add something to the line of the Dwarfs. I mean, the Dwarfs don't even have a decent tar pit unit. I mean, you could argue that the miners or the warriors are decent enough at tar pitting because they can just outlast things, but they don't have anything that's a complete throwaway unit that they can just, okay, we'll throw this to the wind, and it's not a big deal if we get charged. We can now route things around. So I'd really like to see something happen to the Dwarfs in the coming months or years before Warhammer 3 gets launched. And if you guys have any suggestions on things you'd like to see done to the Dwarfs instead, or in addition, Go ahead and let me know in the comment section below. I'd love to kind of get this conversation going, because I think that we talk a lot about upcoming DLCs and upcoming old world updates and upcoming games, you know, game 3. But I think that, like I've said like 5 times in this video already, if we don't talk about the Dwarfs now, it'll just be too late. And we'll get the Chaos Dwarfs, we'll get the Chaos Daemons, we'll get sick, awesome Ogre Kingdoms. Even looking at a Southern Realms style Dogs of War, there's ogres in that, there's dragons in that, there's a whole bunch of different things in the Dogs of War that would still just make it miserable for the Dwarfs. So again, guys, as always, thank you so much for watching here today. I did want to just kind of cover this subject pretty quickly, because a lot of you guys even talked about it in my Beastwind Old World update video, saying like, hey, you know, what about the Dwarfs? I think that they're really in a bad situation right now. So I wanted to kind of get this conversation started and out in the wild and kind of get your opinion. So as always, please go ahead, leave a comment below about what you'd like to see changed or added to the Dwarf campaign, roster, whatever it is that you think is severely lacking with the Dwarfs. Maybe it's the fact that they don't have a legendary Lord Runesmith like Thoric Ironbrow, like I think, or maybe it's the fact that they don't have a named engineer. Anything that you guys want to bring up, please by all means say it in the comment section below. But don't forget to like, subscribe, comment below, all that kind of fun action I always talk about. And if you do subscribe, go ahead and hit the bell icon and turn on all notifications if you're feeling it. That way you can find out anytime I do a stream, anytime I cover patch notes for Bannerlord, anytime I talk about any of the upcoming games like Baldur's Gate 3, so on and so forth. Plenty of stuff to be covered on the channel. As always, have a good one and take care.